What if the man who vowed to give you the world turned his back on you because of something beyond your control? If anyone has ever said you're too much, then this story was meant for you. Stay with me, because what unfolds will touch your heart. The train ground to a stop in the biting cold of Cedar Hollow, releasing clouds of steam into the quiet of the fading afternoon. Clara Winslow stepped down from the last car, her hand gripping a worn suitcase, her tall silhouette stretching long across the platform's weathered boards. At 6 feet tall, Clara towered over most men back in Boston, a fact that had invited countless sidelong looks and murmured remarks throughout her life. But she hadn't traveled west seeking approval. She had come to Oregon in search of a new beginning, a true place to call her own, and perhaps, just perhaps, a chance at love. Tucked securely in her coat pocket was the letter that had offered her all of that. For half a year, she had written back and forth with Charles Hargrove, a sawmill owner whose letters were marked by precise handwriting and a polite, thoughtful tone. He never inquired about her height, and she never volunteered the information. Their letters had covered practical matters, recipes for hearty soups, the shipment of timber books they had both enjoyed. It had felt sincere. It had felt safe. Now, brushing down her forest green wool dress handmade with care, Clara inhaled deeply as the final whistle echoed away. This was her clean slate. Yet no one awaited her arrival. Cedar Hollow was a rugged logging town, rough-hewn from pine and perseverance, its muddy roads lined with uneven signs. A handful of loggers lingered outside the saloon, their conversations dying off as she passed. Eyes widened at the sight of her. One man let out a slow, low whistle. From the general store, a man stepped forward, removing his hat as he neared. He was sturdy, sandy-haired, and sported a neatly trimmed beard, but even he did not reach her chin. "Miss Winslow?" he asked, though there was already hesitation in his voice. "Mr. Hargrove," she replied with steady calm, extending a gloved hand. "It's truly good to meet you." He accepted her hand, but released it almost immediately, his gaze flickering from her face to her boots and then back up again. "You didn't mention your, stature." She met his eyes unwaveringly. "No, I didn't. You're shorter than me." "Yes," she answered plainly. He took a step back. "I need a wife who fits the role." "The role," she repeated. "A wife should look up to her husband," he muttered. His words clipped and strained as laughter bubbled behind him from the saloon porch. Clara drew herself taller. "You said you wanted a partner, someone to build a life with." "I wanted someone normal," he said, grimacing. "Someone of average height." Though her heart splintered, she did not let it show. "You mean someone small enough not to stand out? I'll make arrangements for your return," he said, already retreating. "The eastbound train will be here in the morning." "I spent everything I had just to come here," she said quietly. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, already turning his back, truly. And with that, he disappeared. The men outside the saloon hadn't stopped watching. One hollered, "Need a hand with that bag, miss. Looks tiny in those big ol' hands." Another round of laughter followed. Clara didn't respond. She stepped off the platform, her boots sinking into the thick mud. Her suitcase seemed heavier than it had when she left the train, yet she bore it without a word, as she always had. She passed the general store, the saloons, the weathered church with its flaking white paint, and made her way to the town's edge where the towering pines stood like silent sentinels. She found a fallen log, sat down, and watched her breath cloud the frigid air, allowing the stillness to wrap around her. Then a voice broke the quiet from behind her. "Quite the view from up here, huh?" She turned, startled. A man stood a few yards away, arms folded, his sleeves rolled up despite the chill. He was taller than her by a few inches, with a thick beard and striking blue eyes. His voice was calm, deep, and steady. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you," he said. "Name's Daniel Whitaker. I run the logging camp up north. There's a boarding house in town run by Martha Webb. Decent beds, hot meals. I can walk you there if you want." She paused, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Why are you helping me?" Because no one should be left stranded, he said simply. And because people like you, the ones who don't quite fit, they are the ones who end up changing everything. She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. All right, Mr. Whitaker. Daniel, he corrected her kindly. As they made their way toward the lights of Cedar Hollow, she felt the eyes of the townspeople on her. But with Daniel walking beside her, their stares didn't sting as much. They didn't cut as deep. Maybe tomorrow she would leave. Maybe she would stay. But tonight she wasn't alone. And for the first time since getting off that train, that was enough. The following morning, golden sunlight spilled through the curtains of a second-floor room at Webb's boarding house. Clara shifted under the thick quilt, her body aching from the long journey and the heavier emotions that had weighed on her the day before. She stayed still for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had been abandoned at the station, discarded like a forgotten package, but she had not been broken. Not entirely. Something inside her, whether pride or resilience, refused to diminish. Downstairs, the smell of brewing coffee and bacon frying drew her from the comfort of her bed. When she entered the kitchen, Martha Webb turned from the stove with a warm smile. Morning, Miss Winslow. Sleep well, better than I thought I would, Clara answered instinctively, ducking as she stepped through the doorway. You don't need to stoop here, Martha said, her eyes twinkling. My husband was as tall as a pine tree. He had all the doorways raised when we built this place. Said he got tired of living like a hunchback. Ilalana straightened up a bit more. Such thoughtfulness was rare. Thank you, she said softly. They shared a simple breakfast of eggs, bread, and black coffee. Afterward, Martha wiped her hands dry on a dish towel. So, what's your plan? She asked. Clara glanced down at her empty cup. I think I'll stay for now. I can sew mostly practical clothing. I could earn my keep, Martha responded without hesitation. The small room off the back porch used to be my sewing space. It's yours now if you want it. Good lighting, decent space. I'd love to see it put to good use again. I wouldn't want to impose, Clara said hesitantly. Nonsense, Martha said, waving her hand dismissively. Besides, my winter coat needs mending, and I don't have the patience for fine stitches anymore. By mid-morning, Clara had unpacked her sewing kit and turned the dusty back room into a humble sewing workshop. She ran her fingers over the sturdy wool, crisp cotton, and scattered bits of calico she had brought from Boston. There was work to be done. Word spread quickly. By noon, 3 women had already arrived, each with dresses needing alterations. Mrs. Peterson, the town's former seamstress, came by with a shawl, muttering as she squinted. My hands aren't what they used to be, but you've got sharp eyes and steady hands. While Clara was taking measurements, a shadow fell across the doorway. Miss Winslow, Daniel Whitaker, said, removing his hat. Clara straightened up. Daniel, I thought you were heading back to camp. I am. Just wanted to see if you were still around. I am, she answered. Good, he said, pausing briefly. Thinking of staying a while. I might, she replied. Daniel gave a nod. Then I have a proposition. My men go through their gear like wild animals. Up north, no one can sew a straight line. We could sure use a skilled seamstress. Clara blinked momentarily, taken aback. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you steady pay for mending? Could be good business. That's generous. Daniel shifted, looking slightly awkward. Not generous, just sensible. You've got skill. I've got torn shirts. Fair exchange. She smiled. All right, it's a deal. Before leaving, Daniel paused. There's a church social next Saturday. Whole town will be there. Might be a good place to meet people. Maybe pick up some orders. Are you going? Not usually my thing, he said. But maybe this time. Clara watched him go, tall, solid, and silent as a pine. The following days rushed by in a flurry of fabric and stitching. Women arrived with faded dresses, men with shirts ripped along the seams, and mothers clutched overalls worn thin. Clara worked with a rhythm she hadn't realized she missed, yet the stares persisted. In the saloon, they nicknamed her the giant seamstress. Whispers trailed her down every street, but she kept her head held high. She always had. One evening, while she stitched a coat lining, Martha stuck her head through the door. "That Mr. Whitaker sent word, says one of his men will bring a bundle of repairs next week." "Already?" Clara asked, surprised. "Told the boys you're the best stitcher west of Portland. You've got yourself a fan." Clara looked down at her sewing, a quiet smile creeping onto her face. She didn't have a husband, and her home back east was gone. But here, in a little pine-framed corner of Oregon, she had thread purpose, and maybe the beginning of something new. Not a love story yet, but perhaps the start of one. Saturday arrived under a sky so blue it seemed freshly scrubbed. The church social was the talk of Cedar Hollow. Tables piled high with pies stretched across the hall, fiddles tuned by the pulpit, and the scent of roasted chicken floated through open windows. Clara stood in front of her mirror at Webb's boarding house, smoothing the fabric of her best dress, a deep burgundy wool with copper embroidery at the collar. It wasn't new, but it was hers, sewn by her own hand. It fit her well, strong at the seams, both practical and proud. She pinned her hair up, letting a few soft curls fall around her face, and gazed at her reflection. No corset, no stooping, just a tall woman in a good dress prepared to be seen. When she entered the church hall, the room hushed slightly. She was used to it. That silence had followed her since childhood whenever she didn't quite meet expectations, but tonight, it didn't ache. Let them look. Some nodded, some whispered, some smiled. The kind of surprised smile given to a tall woman who held herself like she belonged. Martha, Webb swept in like a grand ship in full sail. "You look marvelous," she whispered. "They're going to wish they hadn't said a word about you." Clara laughed, the tightness easing from her chest like thread slipping free from a needle. "That's not my aim." "No, but it's a nice perk," Martha said, giving her a wink. For an hour, Clara moved through the gathering, meeting the townsfolk with Martha's guidance. The doctor, the school teacher, the widow from the post office. They asked about her sewing, admired her handiwork. One woman, standing shoulder high to Clara, leaned closer and said, "You know, I could never reach the top shelf in my pantry. You're already a blessing." Then the music quieted, or maybe it just seemed that way because Daniel Whitaker had stepped through the doorway. Tall and broad, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt that still seemed a little out of place on him. Yet no one noticed the discomfort. He seemed like the forest had donned its Sunday best, and he was staring directly at her. He crossed the room with slow, steady steps. A few nodded at him, but none dared stop him. "Miss Winslow," he said when he reached her side. "You look well." "As do you," she replied, her voice unexpectedly soft. "I didn't expect you to come." "I said I might," Daniel responded. "I didn't say I wouldn't." That was how he was understated, blunt, and entirely sincere. They conversed, drifting toward the edge of the room where candlelight flickered across the hardwood floor and the fiddle music began again. The Reverend greeted them both with warm enthusiasm, nodding toward the dance floor. Daniel looked at her. "Would you care to dance?" Clara hesitated. "It's been a while. Then we'll be rusty together." She took his hand. It fit. They moved slowly at first, finding their rhythm. For once, she didn't have to look down. Their eyes were level. Their steps matched. She felt light, not just on her feet, but in her chest, as though someone had loosened a knot she hadn't known she was carrying. As the music swelled, they turned once, twice. Daniel's hand was firm but gentle at her back. He didn't guide her like she was something to control. He moved with her like an equal. "You're staring," Daniel murmured. "I'm not used to this," she admitted. "Most men can't handle dancing with a tall woman." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Most men are fools." When the reel ended, they stood by the refreshment table, each with a glass of cider. Clara glanced toward the back pews and froze. Charles Hargrove was standing there watching them. His eyes narrowed, his mouth twisted into something between a sneer and a smirk. Daniel followed her gaze. "Ignore him." "I intend to." But Charles wasn't done. He crossed the room, his polite smile firmly in place. "Miss Winslow," he said, "Mr. Whitaker didn't expect to see either of you tonight." Daniel stiffened. We're here like everyone else. Of course, Charles said smoothly. Though some might say the sight of certain pears might make tongues wag. Clara tilted her head. Let them wag. I've been talked about my entire life. It doesn't change who I am. Charles's smile tightened. Cedar Hollow has its traditions. Then maybe it's time those traditions caught up, she replied coolly. Charles's eyes flicked to Daniel, then back to her. Well, enjoy the dance floor, Miss Winslow. Though I do wonder, do your feet fit on it? It was a cheap shot. Daniel took a step forward, but Clara stopped him with a hand on his arm. She looked Charles dead in the eye. I'd rather have feet too big for the floor than a heart too small for the truth. Charles flushed. You're making a mistake. Number one just stopped making yours, she replied. He turned and left his boots echoing across the hardwood. Daniel exhaled. You handled that better than I would have. Clara turned back to him. You give me courage. He smiled, small but genuine. You already had it. I just reminded you it was there. The rest of the night passed in a glow of fiddle music conversation and the warm buzz of something that might have been the beginning of love. As they stepped into the cold evening air, Daniel walked her back to the boarding house. The moon hung low over the pines, casting silver light on the snow-dusted rooftops. At the gate, he paused. Thank you for the dance. Thank you for showing up, she said. It meant more than you know. Daniel looked at her, something like reverence in his eyes. You are remarkable, Miss Winslow. And before she could reply, he tipped his hat and turned toward the road, his tall frame disappearing into the dark. Inside, Martha looked up from her knitting and said, Well, you've got him thinking about more than lumber tonight. Clara smiled quietly. She didn't reply. She simply touched her collar where his hand had rested and made her way upstairs for once, not trying to take up less space in the world, but instead daring to finally fill it. The days following the social at the church unfolded like a soft, persistent snowfall. Quiet, slow, yet impossible to ignore. The air had turned colder with mornings crisp from the frost, and Clara found herself falling into a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. By day, she stitched away in the back room of the boarding house, her sewing machine humming like a lullaby. Orders arrived faster than she could complete them. Mending clothes for the loggers, repairing dresses for the pastor's wife, crafting a custom coat for the general store clerk who blushed every time he handed over a new piece of clothing. She even made curtains for the schoolhouse sturdy wool ones that kept the heat better than the thin lace that had hung there before. But it wasn't just the work that filled her time. Daniel had returned to the northern camp the day after the social, and with him a strange quiet settled over Clara's days. He had left a note, his neat handwriting on thick paper. You dance better than most men I know swinging an axe. I'll be back in a week. Until then, keep standing tall. Gee. She kept the note tucked inside her pattern book, reading it more times than she would admit to anyone. A week passed. Then, too, the second Saturday arrived with a snowstorm, the kind that warned of a long winter ahead. The town huddled together, fires burning in every hearth, chimneys, coughing smoke into the gray sky. Martha Webb, never one to be bothered by the weather, made venison stew and kept a pot of tea going all day. Clara helped with the chores, trying not to look at the road too often. He said he'd return today, but the road remained empty. By evening, as the wind picked up and the snow fell thick and fast, worry began to seep in. Clara sat at the parlor window, her hands still from sewing, staring out at the thick white curtain that had swallowed the town. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door. Martha answered it, revealing a young man, one of Daniel's loggers. His face was flushed from the cold snow, packed into his boots and sleeves. "Miss Winslow?" he asked, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. "Yes," she said, already standing. "It's Mr. Whitaker. There's been an accident." The words hit her like a gust of wind to the chest. "He's alive," the logger added quickly. "But he's badly hurt. A tree slide caught him and his horse up on Raven Ridge. He got the other men out, but he didn't make it clear himself." Martha was already grabbing her medical bag. Clara didn't ask questions. She simply pulled on her boots, coat, and scarf. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "Where is he?" "Dr. Phillips' house. We didn't dare bring him farther than town." The snow was knee-deep in some places, drifting up against the buildings and blocking the road. But she pushed through it, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. Inside Dr. Phillips' house, the warmth hit her all at once. 4 loggers huddled near the fire, their faces pale and drawn. The smell of pine sweat, blood, and antiseptic filled the air. "He's asking for you," Mary Simmons said quietly, appearing at her side. She wore an apron stained with blood, her expression tight, but not unkind. "You can go in, but only for a moment." Clara nodded and stepped into the back room. Daniel lay on a cot, barely big enough to fit him. Bandages wrapped tightly around his torso and head. His right leg was splinted and elevated, the wool blanket stained at the knee. But his eyes were still. Daniel fierce focused, and even now full of that unmistakable spark, impossible stillness. "You came," he rasped. "Of course I did," she whispered, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "It's not as bad as it looks." He tried to joke but winced as the words escaped his lips. "You're a terrible liar," she murmured gently, brushing the hair from his forehead. "You should stick to forestry." He chuckled but winced again. "I'll be fine," he said. "Just hate lying still." "Then you'll have to learn patience," she said. "Fortunately, I'm quite skilled at teaching it." A long silence settled between them. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the storm howled. "I thought about you," Daniel said suddenly. "Every day." Clara's throat tightened. "I thought about you too," she whispered. The door opened softly and Dr. Phillips entered. "That's enough for now. Miss Winslow, he needs rest." Daniel's fingers tightened around hers as she stood. "Come back tomorrow?" he asked, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "I'll come back every day," she replied, and she did. Over the next week, Clara came each morning, sometimes with fresh bread, sometimes with books, and sometimes with nothing but a quiet presence that Daniel clung to as if it were his very breath. He improved slowly. The fever never returned. The splint held. The pain began to subside. But when Mary Simmons brought him some broth and found them quietly laughing at one of his dreadful jokes, Clara saw something change in her eyes. It wasn't jealousy nor regret, but recognition. Mary saw what they were building, and though she didn't speak a word, Clara understood that this was going to get harder before it got easier, because Cedar Hollow had a love for gossip, and not everyone wanted to see the tall woman and the scarred foreman find something resembling happiness. But Daniel was healing, and she would be there every day, standing tall at his side even when the storm returned. By the end of the second week, Daniel could sit up for longer periods, though he still winced whenever the pain caught him by surprise. The bruises on his ribs had turned yellow. The gash above his eyebrow was healing cleanly, and Dr. Phillips seemed cautiously optimistic. Clara hadn't missed a single day. Every morning she arrived with something fresh, Linen's stew that Martha had simmered overnight. A book, a smile. Sometimes she stayed for an hour, sometimes for the entire afternoon, quietly mending garments at his bedside while he rested or shared stories from the camp. But Cedar Hollow was beginning to take notice. It began with whispers followed by glances, then questions disguised as concern. Was it proper for a single woman to visit an injured man every day? Was she just his seamstress? Or was there something more? And wasn't it curious how quickly she'd become essential? Martha predictably dismissed it with a snort. These people don't know what to do with a woman who walks taller than their expectations, she muttered, slicing carrots into the stew pot. Clara tried not to let it bother her. She had endured worse, but the eyes followed her down Main Street, in the general store, and at church. Charles Hargrove didn't make it any easier. He had stopped pretending to ignore her. Now, whenever their paths crossed, he gave her a smug smile, as if he were watching a slow disaster unfold. Once, while passing her on the boardwalk, he tipped his hat and said, "Some folks just can't help but make a spectacle of themselves." She didn't respond, but his words lingered. Inside the doctor's house, things felt safe, warm. Daniel's presence, even injured, had a gravity to it. When he spoke, she paid close attention. When he smiled, something deep inside her loosened. Yet Mary Simmons remained ever present, helpful, composed, and flawlessly courteous. Clara could not shake the certainty that Daniel's former fiancé knew precisely what she was doing. Nothing blatant, nothing harsh, just an enduring presence, a shared past that lingered around them unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. On the 18th day of Daniel's recovery, Dr. Phillips delivered his advice. "It's time," he said to them both. "You're well enough to leave this place, but no stairs, no unnecessary excitement, and someone needs to keep a close watch on you." Daniel shifted his gaze from Clara to Martha. "I have a room ready," Martha said without missing a beat. "The back parlor has a pull-out couch and gets plenty of sun." Clara blinked in surprise. "You never mentioned that?" Martha only shrugged. "Didn't want you worrying about logistics while he was still bleeding through the sheets." Daniel gave a low chuckle and winced. The following morning, 2 of his loggers carried him stretcher-style into the Webb boarding house. They grunted under the weight but wore proud expressions. Clara was already inside, laying down fresh sheets, plumping pillows, and doing her best not to appear anxious. He made himself comfortable swiftly, perhaps too swiftly. By the 2nd day, he grew restless. By the 3rd, sullen. By the 4th, he requested his crutch. "You can't walk yet," Clara said, folding her arms. "I can try. You're not trying anything until that leg is healed," she replied firmly. He grumbled but gave in. That afternoon, with heavy snow muffling the world outside the parlor windows, they played cards. Martha had taught them a traditional Lakota version of poker, and Daniel teased Clara about bluffing like a seasoned gambler. She smiled. "I've spent my whole life pretending not to be hurt. You think I can't fake a good hand?" They laughed together, and for a while the heaviness lifted. But that evening, a knock echoed through the boarding house. Martha answered it to find Charles Hargrove standing proudly on the porch, his coat immaculate despite the falling snow. "I'm here to see Mr. Whitaker," he declared. "Why?" Martha asked, arms crossed firmly. "Town matters," Charles said curtly. Martha didn't move. "Speak here or not at all." Charles stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Clara sitting next to Daniel's couch, repairing a shirt. "Well," he drawled, "isn't this a cozy scene?" Daniel pushed himself upright slightly. "Get to the point. The Railroad Commission vote happens in 4 days," Charles said smoothly. "You've missed every meeting, every discussion. Some would argue you've forfeited your voice." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I'll be there. In your condition, I'll be there," Daniel said again, his voice like steel. Charles's gaze flickered toward Clara. Naturally, inspiration does have its uses. Clara rose to her full height, standing strong and unwavering. "Careful, Mr. Hargrove," she said coolly. "You're mistaking kindness for weakness again." Without a word, Charles turned on his heel, slamming the door behind him. Daniel let out a breath and leaned back against his pillows. "He's planning something." "I know. We need a strategy. You need to rest." Daniel looked at her, really looked, and in that moment something in his expression shifted. "You're not scared, are you?" "No," she answered softly. "Not anymore." A thick blanket of snow draped over every rooftop in Cedar Hollow, muting the outlines of buildings, but not easing the tension threading through the streets. News had spread fast about the upcoming vote, about the disputed land, about Daniel Whitaker's injury, and increasingly, about Clara Winslow. The whispers had evolved. No longer was she just the tall woman who had been turned away by Hargrove. Now she was the one standing with Whitaker. And depending on who you asked, that either showed courage or recklessness. Thursday arrived quickly. Daniel was determined to attend the council meeting, injury notwithstanding. Clara didn't protest. Instead, she made sure his crutch was steady, his coat snug, and the 4 loggers accompanying him knew to keep trouble away. The town hall overflowed, every seat taken, and people packed tightly against the walls. Charles Hargrove stood tall at the front, surrounded by maps and diagrams. He wore his finest suit, though his smile was thin and cold. "I welcome you all," he announced, "to a decision that will define Cedar Hollow's destiny." Daniel was rolled to the front in a specially adjusted chair, his injured leg stretched out. He looked pale, but when he spoke, his voice cut clear across the room. "You know me," he said. "You've seen me haul timber dragmen from wreckage, fight fires, and bury friends. I don't wear fine suits or throw around sweet words, but I know this land, and I know when it's being handed away too cheaply for too little." He pointed toward the map showing the Northern Railroad's path slicing through untouched forest. "They'll clear the trees, level the ridge, and when there's nothing left, they'll move on. And what will we have then?" A low murmur traveled through the crowd. Several council members exchanged uneasy looks. Clara rose to her feet. Heads turned. She towered above everyone else, not just in stature, but in spirit. "I arrived here as a stranger," she said, her voice strong and sure. "I was turned away before I even unpacked my bags, but I stayed because some things are worth standing for." She glanced at Daniel, then back at the gathering. "This town doesn't need quick money. It needs vision, patience, and honor. Here stands a man who has spilled blood for this community, who understands the balance between preserving what matters and preparing for the future. If you reject that, you're not just cutting down trees, you're cutting away the very soul of this town." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then came murmurs, nods, and scattered cheers. Charles stepped forward, composed but frigid. "Let's not forget," he said, "those opposing this vote are not native to Cedar Hollow. They do not carry our history." Daniel sat taller. "You're right," he said. "I wasn't born here. I chose to be here, and I stayed for 10 winters, 10 summers, 10 years of building something real. Can you say the same? Hargrove?" Judge Porter struck the gavel sharply. "That's enough time to vote." The council retreated into a side chamber. The room hummed with nervous energy. Clara felt her heart thudding against her ribs. When the council returned, Judge Porter cleared his throat. "By a margin of 3-2, the council has voted against the northern expansion. The southern route will move forward." The hall erupted, some with anger, most with relief. Daniel exhaled deeply, closing his eyes. Clara squeezed his shoulder gently. They had won, but it wasn't only land they had saved. They had defended their worth, their place. The next week, Daniel moved permanently into the Webb boarding house to recover. The town's demeanor shifted cautiously but kindly, like ice giving way to spring. Women brought Clara fabrics and fresh pies. Children smiled and waved as she passed by. Even the blacksmith came forward one afternoon to ask if she might teach his teenage daughter the art of tailoring. And so, in the quiet town of Cedar Hollow, under the silver glow of a winter moon, Clara Winslow and Daniel Whitaker proved that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not with fists or grand speeches, but with resilience, kindness, and the courage to stand tall when it matters most. Their story reminds us all that true belonging isn't something you're given, it's something you build, one brave choice at a time. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. We'll be right here, bringing you stories that remind you, no matter how the world tries to shape you, there's always a place where you're meant to stand, just as you are. Until next time, keep believing, keep standing tall, and keep writing your own story.